So, what is going on with Israel Iran? Before we look at some of the major news headlines, I want to talk about how strategic what's going on in Israel, Iran, and the Middle East at large is, and how it relates to the 2024 election. So, I've talked about in the past some of Biden's largest problems are going to come from specifically the Israeli Palestinian conflict and the issues surrounding them. Why? Well, traditionally, Palestinians and Muslims at large, and of course most Arabs, but of course not all Muslims are Arabs. You guys know what I mean. Vote Democratic, but there's some interesting data that could be flipping. And first of all, I also want to keep in mind that around 30 to 35% of Muslim Americans actually voted for Trump in 2020, which is a far larger margin than African Americans, and used to be what Hispanic Americans were, although that margin is now 50-50. So Muslim Americans aren't by and large just some pro-Biden bloc, even if the majority of them are voting for Biden. And that started in 2020. The stuff going on between Israel and Palestine has really changed the game, and it all has to kind of do with marketing because Biden's in a tough spot. Most, I think, Jewish people tend to vote Democratic. I've seen some numbers that range from like 70% will vote Democratic to about 30% will vote Republican. And that kind of fits in line with actually how Muslims vote, which is about a 70-30 split. But what's tough is those two factions right now are really against each other. One of the hardest things in our two-party system for the parties to operate under is their coalitions. And that's always been kind of like a strategic issue in the Democratic and Republican parties is the big tent versus small tent strategists. So in political strategy, there's always this idea that we can win an election for Republicans or Democrats if we expand our tent. Expanding the tent is including other types of voters. But this is tough because the wider your tent means sometimes you can't go as deep. So you can have a small tent and you can go deeper into those voter bases and motivate those specific types of people to come out and vote for you. Or you can broaden it with the possibility of sacrificing certain groups by being broad. For example, this Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's currently going on tends to be losing Biden both voters on the Palestinian and Muslim side and on the Jewish side, which is completely fascinating. So here's why he's in a tough spot. So first of all, by and large, Americans don't want another war. They've already expressed their disdain at the funding of Ukraine. And even though Ukraine is kind of a bipartisan issue, at least in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans want to fund the war. And even though there's still a lot of Democrats specifically who support the war in Ukraine and a lot of Republicans who don't, there's still kind of some overlap between those two factions and parties. But here's what's tough is when Russia's the priority, Russia's main source of income, their main source of GDP, which translates into power, is oil. And a conflict in the Middle East would just cause oil prices to go up even further, enriching Russia. And it would also, a war in the Middle East would also cause inflation to skyrocket in the United States. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we've been experiencing inflation in the United States. I tend to believe that majority of it actually doesn't have to do with printing money, even though that is a cause. I believe most of it has to do with supply chains, believe it or not, and that the supply chain shocks and issues have artificially, I shouldn't say artificially, but essentially created the inflation that we have. And of course, there's some corporatist, price gouging in there, I'm sure. But the majority of it is supply chains, especially when it comes to energy and energy being more expensive. And some of those decisions, I think, were made by the Biden administration. I don't think it just happens to be that Trump spends a lot of money and then that money's inflationary consequences just happen to kick in as soon as Biden gets into office, right? I think there's more to it. I think more of it has to do with some of the factual policies that Biden implemented around supply chains and specifically oil and gas. And you can see some of the effects if you look at supply chains. For every dollar or every cent that gas increases, it's an exponential effect on how that affects costs across the board in America, because everything that's transportable is transported via gas, right? Via some kind of oil product, some kind of fossil fuel, so to speak. So it's a tricky situation for the Biden administration, just geopolitically. No one wants a new war. And suffice to say that Iran is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It is a fully fledged country with about 70 to 80 million people, I believe, with a huge military, a huge base, advanced weaponry from both Russia and China. And they've been preparing for war with the United States for, I don't know, 2 decades, maybe more, maybe since, the mullahs overthrew the Shah. I mean, it's been quite some time. We haven't really fought a war with a country directly like Iran in quite some time. Even though things with Russia are heating up and becoming more direct, still it's all proxy warfare. And the amount of Americans in Ukraine would be a completely different story than the amount of Americans who go to Iran. So Biden has this tricky geopolitical situation, but when it comes to marketing, it's kind of killing him at the polls, because if he wants to back Israel as much as the Jewish population in America wants him to back Israel, and I'm speaking by and large, I know that there's plenty of Jewish Americans who do not support Israel going to war with Iran. So I just want to clarify that. But from what I've seen and what I've read, it seems that majority want him to have a stronger stance with Israel. Him having a stronger stance in Israel essentially means him going along with Netanyahu's plans, which Netanyahu's plans are infamously, let's be provocative, let's provoke, because we know the United States has our back, and really almost get the United States into a war with Iran, which Americans don't want, but I'm sure Netanyahu does. And so if Biden were to follow through on that policy, yes, maybe more Jewish Americans would feel favorable about his positioning in supporting a strong American-Israeli relationship. But it's going to hurt him with the key demographic of Muslim and Arab American voters. And that's a coalition that in some of the swing states is incredibly strategic. Now, I haven't done the math to figure out if the Jewish vote in America is as strategic as the Muslim vote in America. Of course, the Jewish vote, I would argue, is primarily in states like Florida, which is solid red, and New York, which is solid blue. But of course, you have a big Jewish donor lobby through things like AIPAC. So maybe it doesn't translate into votes, but it does translate into cash. And I'm not entirely sure whether AIPAC is going to fund or defund Biden based on his foreign policy with Iran and Israel. But voters will change. The fact is, he hasn't been strong on his position with Israel. And recently, he essentially told Israel that they would not be supporting Israel if they go and attack Iran. And it's part of the reason why Iran has been so calculated, because they know, and all the countries know this, they know it's a presidential election in America. They know how volatile our politics are. They know when they're going to war, when Iran's sending missiles, when Russia's going to war, they're not stupid. They know that they can play into certain aspects of American democracy and make their moves based on that. You could argue that they make moves based because maybe they're scared of Trump coming back and having a stronger position, or that they just want to show chaos and they view the transitionary period between presidents as a perfect time to strike, or that they think that now is the best time to sit and wait because maybe they think Trump's going to act differently, right? So foreign powers are very astute when it comes to when they're going to make their moves, because they understand that the United States still is the global superpower, but currently has a very heated debate going on within itself about where Americans want to take the country. And that all surrounds our 2024 election. So then on the flip side, we have Biden potentially being friendly to the Palestinian cause, offering a two-state solution. And that hasn't really come out of his mouth. He's been very weak on that issue. And so you're seeing one of his key factions essentially turn away from him. And I could argue, now that I'm saying it out loud, that Muslim Americans, not from a money perspective, but from a voter perspective, could be crucial for the 2024 election because of places like Michigan and Wisconsin and maybe some other swing states, but primarily those in the Rust Belt and primarily those within the Blue Wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I always forget what the other state is. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I can never remember Minnesota. Maybe that's because they're not important. It's too cold to live there. But Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, right, have huge Muslim populations. And I think it was in Minnesota where about 100,000 Muslims, when they were in the primary for Biden, decided that they were going to check a box that said, like, none of the above or none of these, essentially saying that 100,000 people are not going to vote for you, Biden, which Donald Trump won. I think it was Minnesota, could have been Michigan, by just like 25,000 votes. And then Biden won that same state by about 100,000 votes. So they know the power that they have. But it doesn't seem to be working because Biden hasn't changed course. And so once again, he's in a really tricky situation because how does he balance America's national interests in the Middle East and foreign policy and maintaining a stronghold on his voter base, the Democratic voter base, for the 2024 election? No matter what move he makes, whether it's strong on Israel or soft on Israel, strong on Palestine or soft on Palestine, he's losing voters because everyone views him as weak. And that's not a good look. And he can't go to war because going to war would really hurt his chances of winning the election even further. So he's in a really tight spot. And it's very interesting because it seems to be a lose-lose no matter what. So when you're in these tight spots, what do you do? And I'm not necessarily advocating for the Biden administration to do this, but when you're thinking of marketing, you're thinking of propaganda, you're thinking of like what a good message is. Because frankly, Biden hasn't been speaking, Kamala hasn't been speaking, and that's the key. That's the key that I think is their strategy. Is they probably, number one, don't want to talk about it because it'll be worse for them to say something stupid and have that echoed throughout the rest of the presidential campaign than to say nothing. And I'm not going to lie, that's a perfect strategy. Well, it's not perfect, but it's the best that they got. Two, by not speaking, they can't make people more angry than they already are. People hate inaction, but they view you as lazy or incompetent or stupid. But people have a tolerance for incompetence more so than they have a tolerance for someone who they view as an enemy. It's why Trump is so loved or hated. You're either on one side or you're not. And that hate is what drives a lot of people to vote for anybody but Trump. So, and that's why, Trump has that because he's so outspoken on everything. Whereas Biden's strategy is going to be, let me speak as little as possible because people, depending on how this situation in the Middle East goes, people will forget what happened and the atrocities. And that's pretty terrible to say, and it's really unfortunate to say, but that's just how Americans are. There was a poll recently that maybe I could pull up when I start screen sharing, talking about how people felt about Trump. And the polling question was essentially something along the lines of, has Trump offended you in the past 6 months? Has Trump offended you personally in the past 6 months? And the answer for that was like 20% of the people said yes. And 40% were like, no, not within the past 6 months, which is fascinating. Why is that fascinating? Because Trump, the election's all about Trump. It's not about his foreign policy. It's not about his economic policy. It's not about his decisions. It has everything to do with Trump himself, Trump the person, right? Who he is. And even though I've always thought that that's kind of ridiculous, right? Because I don't think you vote based on personality, although I understand the logic of that argument. It just, for me, I look at actions more than I do words. What's interesting is people are already forgetting how much they hated Donald Trump. That's a big deal. If you look at when Obama was first elected, a lot of the hate toward George Bush started to go away, right? And he was kind of, and maybe the Obamas helped with that because, Michelle Obama and George Bush had a pretty friendly relationship. And so there was some marketing there. And foreign policy wise, I don't know if I can say that Obama and Bush were that different as a whole. Of course, they had different strategies and different approaches, but it seemed like it was a different train on the same train tracks, if you know what I mean. But once Trump was elected, what's interesting is that was probably the first time where Bush's favorability actually started to go down because Trump made the Iraq war such a talking point for his Republican campaign. And then I'm not entirely sure how Obama's polling did either. Of course, Jeb Bush didn't help his brother, and his favorability either. But for the most part, Americans have such short-term memories that the previous administration always seems better because things get crazier and we live in the moment. We live day by day. And so when we tie that back to Biden's strategy handling this conflict, all that matters is from September of this year, September 2024 onward, those crucial 2 months are going to be the key to winning the election. And so I think that Biden is hoping they have a solution by then. And it is quite possible. It's quite possible because so much could happen between now and then. It's a long time and it's not. And so if you're thinking about like Trump's trial and Trump's prosecutions, and the foreign policy around the war with Iran and Israel potentially and the escalation there, if that all gets done now and comes to some kind of conclusion, and that includes, by the way, unfortunately, the Gaza conflict. I mean, we're looking at all kinds of bad things going on there, and nothing's really happening. And Biden might be losing a voter base, but are they going to care in 6 months? Are they going to care in 4 months? If it comes to a conclusion and all these Gazans have moved out of the Gaza Strip and are somewhere else, and it's not in the media headlines anymore, and we're talking about a post-Gaza conflict instead of the current Gaza conflict, will that change how people vote? I think it will. I unfortunately think people just have terrible memories. And they vote based on how they feel right here and right now. That's also tough for Biden because as long as the economy and inflation tends to do poorly, that's blamed on him. And people beyond COVID mostly remember cheap gas and a quote unquote booming economy under Trump. Whether the statistics show that or not, all that matters is how people feel. The data, the actuality of the economy doesn't matter as much as how people feel. Right. And that's very crucial. So I think if you're a strategist and you're a marketing guy, especially if you're in the intersection of politics and marketing, which really borderlines on propaganda, I think this is one of the most interesting issues to watch is how Biden's going to handle the Iran and Gaza and Israel issues, because no matter what, it seems like a lose-lose situation for him. I don't see how he markets his way out of this other than staying out of the limelight and just simply not talking. He looks weaker the more you see him. And the more you hear him speak, the less confidence you have in him. And that could go for Kamala Harris too. So that means their only option is to just frankly keep him out of the news cycle altogether. And that's exactly what I think they're going to do.